Céline Dion.
My dream, to be international star.
Could it happen again? Could Celine Dion happen again?
I'm Thomas Leblanc, and Celine Understood is a 4-part series from CBC Podcasts and CBC News, where I piece together the surprising circumstances that helped manufacture Celine Dion, the pop icon. Celine Understood, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Some industries are more than just a big part of a province's economy. They are a part of its identity. Quebec has maple syrup. Newfoundland, for a long, long time, had cod. Alberta, of course, has oil. And in British Columbia, it's salmon. It's not the province's largest industry, but it is one of its signature exports. Salmon just feels like BC. And much of that salmon comes from farms. You might be able to picture them now. Floating docks, dozens of pens, tons of fish, growing to harvesting size in the open ocean. And, according to all sorts of advocates, and in recent years the government as well, causing all sorts of problems while they do that. Fish farms in BC have been under attack for years, and they are slowly but surely feeling the impact. Right now, the industry is frantically paddling to keep its head above water with a deadline looming that most manufacturers say they won't be able to meet. So what is so wrong with farmed salmon anyway? What needs to change for this industry to survive? Is it even possible? And if not, what happens to the future of BC salmon as wild stocks dwindle and the farms disappear? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Shannon Waters is a BC politics and environmental reporter for The Narwhal. Hey, Shannon.
Hi, good morning.
Thank you for finding the time to talk about this. It's a fascinating topic.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. I'm looking forward to discussing it.
Why don't you start by telling us all about Skookum John? Who is he? What's he been advocating for years now, I guess?
Yeah, Skookum is not a fan of fish farms, shall we say. He's a member of the Howsett First Nation, and he works out of Tofino. He takes people on whale watching tours on Clayoquot Sound, and he also ferries people around. There's some water access only communities around there, and he also helps a local environmental advocacy organization called Clayoquot Action keep an eye on what is going on at the fish farms that exist in Clayoquot Sound, producing farmed salmon for markets mostly in the States at this point in time, although they do also show up in Canada.
Can you describe the kinds of farms that we're talking about today so people have a sense of like what it is, what it looks like, how it works?
Yes, so fish farms look like a floating dock, I guess, is probably the best way to describe them. There's often a fenced rectangle floating in the ocean with several pens inside it. The pens are below the water, and that's where the fish are raised. And they're often accompanied by a couple of outbuildings. Most of them, they rely on generator power. So there'll be a floating generator shed nearby that runs on diesel. There may be like an initial sort of processing plant there and some boats for transportation of workers. And yeah, they're just this kind of little, well, not so little all the time, but they're these floating sort of islands in the ocean that are producing farmed fish.
And so how far back does the fight against these farms go? And what's the context here?
Well, fish farms have been around in BC for decades. The Howsett First Nation, of which Skookum is a member, inked their first formal agreement with Cermak, I believe it was in 2010, but had fish farms on their territory prior to that. The agreement with the nation was sort of an acknowledgement that Indigenous rights and title were at play and that companies needed to work with First Nations in whose territory they were operating in order to, move forward and be able to address concerns that were brought up by those nations. Opposition to fish farms has been around, just about as long. For Skookum, he started getting really involved in activism against fish farms back in 2015. He was part of an occupation of a planned farm in Clayoquot Sound. That was later, they didn't go ahead with that project due to the local opposition to it. So there's been a lot of tension in and around this industry for a long time.
Just for context, for people who are listening, how much of the fish that we eat is grown on these sorts of farms?
I don't have exact figures. It's proved somewhat difficult to track the larger, picture. What I will say is that a lot of people see farmed salmon as the future and much more aquaculture, so farming of all kinds of species that live in the ocean and people like to eat, as an important food source for the world going forward. The United Nations has called for a large increase, I believe it's about 30%, in aquaculture, sustainable aquaculture across the world over the next decade or so. So there is an interest in being able to grow this industry in certain regards, but what that is going to look like, at least here off the BC coast, is very much up in the air at the moment.
So explain the opposition to these farms then. What's wrong with them, to put it bluntly?
So people have concerns about these farms for a couple of different reasons. One of the main ones is their impact on wild salmon stocks, which have been struggling for decades for various reasons. They face a lot of different challenges, being a species that matures in the ocean and then has to travel back up rivers and past all kinds of human development and disruption in order to reproduce. That's one of the main concerns, that these farms, and they are an industrial type of farming operation, so they come with some of the issues that are associated with industrial farming. There's concern that because they are in the ocean, that any pathogens that are sort of accumulated and occur in these farmed fish can easily be passed on to wild salmon, particularly young salmon that are coming out of the rivers and going into the ocean, and that affects their survival rates. There's also issues with environmental degradation, the waste from these fish falling down to the bottom of the ocean and sort of smothering it, and concerns about their impacts on other wildlife, sea lions, seals, birds, that kind of thing. So it's a sort of faceted issue with concern coming from different angles, but it's not a monolithic issue. There are people who support fish farms, who want to see them continue here in BC, and there are First Nations amongst those groups that, see a future in farmed salmon and are not happy with how the federal government has been handling the industry.
So how exactly, if these fish are farmed in, nets on the ocean, do they impact the wild salmon stock? So
the big issue, and one of the sort of more prominent concerns that comes up when we talk about farmed salmon in BC are sea lice, which are exactly what they sound like. They're an animal that attaches themselves to salmon and drinks their blood and weakens them and can cause all kinds of problems. And because of the concentration of farmed salmon in these pens, sea lice outbreaks have been, in some cases, quite common. And those sea lice aren't contained in the pens. So when wild salmon swim past these nets in the ocean, the sea lice can migrate over and attach themselves to the wild fish. And one of the things that the industry has been trying to do, and some of the requirements that have been set, both by governments and by First Nations in their agreements with these companies, is quotas for how many sea lice can be on the farmed salmon, and trying to keep those levels as low as possible so as to reduce the risk that the sea lice pose to wild salmon.
Do we have any way to quantify that risk, or I guess to quantify the impact of these farms on wild salmon in general? As you mentioned, these fish are already facing a kind of an uphill battle.
Yeah, it's very difficult to say this industry is definitely pushing the species to extinction all on its own, pushing wild salmon to extinction all on its own. Mm-hmm. There's just so many other things going on, from, pollution to environmental degradation to, sport fishing and the continued pressure on wild stocks from, people who want to be able to go out there and hook their own fish. But there is a body of scientific evidence that there are negative impacts from the farms that are affecting wild salmon, and that in combination with these other factors, some of which are even more difficult to deal with, that having these farms operating in wild salmon habitat in the ocean is just not sustainable if we want to see wild salmon continuing to exist and hopefully to recover in some way.
So as this criticism has grown louder over years, decades, what has the government done about these fish farms?
So fish farms in BC have been a hot topic for a long time. Right. I started covering provincial politics in 2017 and covered the BC NDP government's handling of phasing out open net pen farms in certain parts of the province. So the Broughton Archipelago and the Discovery Islands were two where they've shut down those farms as local First Nations called for that to happen. They didn't want these farms operating in their territory and had called for them to be shut down. But the industry itself has kind of been in limbo since about 2015, which is when the federal government first said, we're going to phase out these farms. And
when were they supposed to phase them out by?
So the commitment was to have open net pen salmon farms done by 2025, out of the water, no longer posing any kind of threat to wild salmon. Then in June, we had the federal government recommit to a new timeline, which is by 2029. So for the past sort of decade, the industry had been put on notice that, something maybe likely is going to happen to affect your ability to do business sometime in the next decade or so. And I think people on both sides of sort of the issue, those who want the farms gone as soon as possible and those who want to see the industry find a path forward, have been waiting to see, which way things are going to go and how the terms of this plan transition, because the government is talking about transitioning the industry rather than just, completely closing it down, how that transition is going to proceed.
Does it matter how open net farming is done? Like, are there ways to protect against parasites? Does it matter what kind of salmon are raised there? Or is it just having these fish in an open pen in the ocean is kind of harmful by its nature?
If you talk to people who are opposed to the industry, they will tell you that there's just no way to farm salmon in the ocean in a way that is sustainable and environmentally friendly. The industry contends that there are steps that can be taken and that there are steps that have been taken to reduce that impact. So one of the things that is happening or has happened in Clayoquot Sound recently is a trialing of a new kind of salmon farm. They call it a semi-closed containment system, and it is for juvenile salmon called smolts. So when they go into the ocean for the first time after being hatched, they are put in this semi-closed containment system, which was described to me as basically like a giant bag in the ocean. And it draws water from deeper in the water column than sea lice can survive. So it helps to keep the sea lice out. And then the containment system is also meant to reduce the exposure to wild salmon, the exposure that they have to sea lice. The trick with the semi-closed containment system is that fish can't grow to a marketable size in it. So they're only put in that system for the first year, and then they have to go into an open net pen to get big enough to sell. So it's not a solution to what the federal government is demanding, which is, closed containment systems, which they're not a mainstream part of the industry at this point in time. In other parts of the world, they are also looking at new technologies to reduce the impacts that farm salmon have on the environment. and especially like wild salmon stocks, but there isn't a closed containment system that's just ready to go for the industry to pick up and move to.
What would a closed containment system look like? Are we talking about just moving everything basically onto land and building, warehouses for farmed salmon?
That's one possibility and currently seems like the most likely one. At this point in time, we haven't seen specifics from the federal government about what they are going to require, what they mean by closed containment, and what sort of standards they're going to put in place for the industry when it comes to, acceptable impacts to wild salmon as a result of these farming operations. So land-based salmon farming has been tried, not particularly thoroughly in Canada. There have not been a lot of land-based farms here, and the ones that have existed are relatively small in scale compared to the open net pen farms. And the thing about raising, species that live in the water on land is you need these massive systems to, keep them alive, keep them healthy, and get them to a marketable size. You need a lot of water, you need a lot of power. It's going to be a very sort of resource intensive move and not a cheap one, which of course, when you're talking about a commodity that's being sold, that is something that is very much a live issue for the people producing that commodity.
Assuming the government goes through this time with its 2029 deadline, what kind of impact would this have on local economies? And I ask this because there are a ton of these fisheries out there. I know my aunt and uncle used to own an open net salmon farm, and they've gotten out of the business because they could see this deadline coming and they were retirement age and et cetera. And that was a small farm compared to these ones. And it still employed like a ton of people on the island. And what do we know about, how many jobs are at stake or what the impact would be?
Yes, it's a pretty bleak picture. I think there's a lot of concern in communities that do rely on these farms for employment, and they are often, fairly remote, small communities on the coast of Vancouver Island or smaller islands around it. So, maybe it's not a huge number of jobs. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans estimated that about 1,600 people were working in aquaculture in total in BC back in 2022. Those were the most current figures I could find. And that would include, other forms of aquaculture. So either raising other fish species, it could be an oyster farm, that includes sort of the whole of the aquaculture industry in the province. So it's a smaller number of people who are working at these farms, but because they're often located in these smaller communities, the impact for those communities could be very significant. It reminds me a bit of the logging industry here in BC, which has been in decline for decades and just continues to shed jobs. And government after government has come in and said, okay, we're going to do things differently. We're going to revive the industry. They spend money on things like technological advancements, but they also spend money on offering workers who lose their jobs, retraining to find a new career, or they might offer money to people who are near retirement age so that they can retire a little earlier than they would have planned. I suspect that if the 2029 deadline comes to pass, that we will see some of that, some support programs for people sort of transitioning out. I think the big question is whether the industry actually makes a transition. And I heard a lot of doubt, a lot of frustration, and, not a lot of optimism from people who are working in the industry and supportive of it, that they will be able to make a transition to a fully closed containment industry that operates on land.
If it's so difficult to do that, and even people in the industry doubt that they can do it, and yet we have the UN and other organizations saying that farmed fish is the future and, we need to move to that and away from overfishing the oceans, how do you walk that line? Like, what does that look like and where's the middle ground?
Yeah, I think that's a big question. And I think the sort of central crux of it is the issue of sustainability and being able to protect and enhance and restore the environment while also meeting human needs. And that never seems to be an easy thing to do. And it's certainly not going to be here when it comes to aquaculture. On the one hand, if you really want to see salmon farms come out of the water, but you want to see, sustainable aquaculture continue as a whole, You probably support land-based systems. But for the industry, though, the question of costs, of available technology, of the feasibility of, taking an industry literally out of the water and putting it on land, it's just, there's a huge challenge there. And one of the things I also wanted to mention was that if the industry makes this transition and becomes land-based, it's not likely to stay in the small communities that it currently supports,
right.
A lot of which don't have great access to the power grid. They may have transportation issues in getting the fish to market. So currently, because of the ocean component, they are, the preferred area for raising these fish. But if they move on to the land, from the people that I spoke to working in the industry, it's much more likely that they will transition to areas that are closer to transportation hubs,
sure,
that have, more reliable power. And so even if the industry survives, the communities that have relied on it for decades may not benefit from it in the way that they have been.
When you speak to, farmers who are in the business now looking for this transition, and B, advocates like Skookum John, what do they think? Is this really the end of the industry, or are they all skeptical because this deadline has been pushed before and pushed again?
The people like Skookum John who want the industry, at the very least, to radically change, if not to sort of come to an end, are skeptical. They've heard these promises from the federal government before. They've seen multiple court cases go back and forth. And with so little detail still about what the federal government is going to require, I heard a lot of skepticism that, 2029 is even going to come to pass. But there's a lot of hope there. For the industry, there's less optimism. I heard a lot of frustration about how the federal government has kind of kept the industry sort of on tenterhooks, waiting to hear, what is required, what needs to be done, what the rules will be. And there's a lot of, awareness around the technological challenges that the industry will face if it is forced to go to closed containment. So one of the people that I spoke to, who is a spokesperson in the industry, said that 2029 could very well spell the end of salmon farming in BC. But even if it does, fish farms aren't going away worldwide, and British Columbians will still eat farmed salmon, as will other Canadians. It will just be coming from other countries like, say, Chile.
I'll ask one more just because I'm curious. There's an election on in BC right now. We are extremely likely to have a federal election in the short term. How might either of those impact this?
So on the provincial side, I don't see a ton of effect there. On the federal side, though, everything could change. If we end up with a federal conservative government and they come in and say, no, we don't have any qualms about fish farms, they can stay, then we're sort of back to where we were, a decade ago. And I suspect we'll see some court challenges at that point from First Nations that are opposed to fish farms near their territories. But everything could shift. So that's just another point of uncertainty that everyone who's been watching this back and forth over fish farms in BC is, aware of, that despite this deadline sort of finally coming forward, everything could change a year from now.
Shannon, thank you so much for this.
Thanks for having me.
Shannon Waters reporting from BC for the Narwhal. That was The Big Story. For more, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can always shoot us feedback on this episode, any episode, or an episode idea you might have. We really appreciate those. You can send them to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca, or you can call us up at 416-935-5935. Leave a voicemail. Talk it out. The Big Story is available in your favorite podcast player and mine, and your best friends, or your worst enemies. You can also get it on your smart speaker by simply asking it to play The Big Story Podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.